My heart shattered as my sister's venomous words sliced through the chandelier-lit room. Happy 35th to our pathetic sister who still rents. Cruel laughter erupted while burning tears threatened to betray me. They mocked my poverty while unknowingly spending my fortune. My fingers trembled with rage as I sent the text that would destroy their perfect lives. Execute Order 35. The puppet master cuts the strings. I am Maya, 35 years old, and tonight was supposed to be a quiet family dinner. Instead, it was an execution. We were seated at Prime 108, an exclusive and notoriously overpriced steakhouse in the heart of Atlanta. The kind of place where the lighting is intentionally dim and the steaks cost more than a car payment. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the people who shared my blood treat me like an unwanted charity case. Chloe, my 28-year-old sister, tapped her crystal champagne flute with a silver dessert spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. She stood up, smoothing down her designer silk dress, a dress paid for by the man sitting next to her. Liam was 32, white, and wore his supposed wealth like a loud and obnoxious cologne. He leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, looking at me with a mixture of pity and utter disdain. "I would like to propose a toast," Chloe announced, her voice carrying loud enough to make the neighboring tables turn and stare. "To Maya. Happy 35th birthday to our pathetic sister who still rents. May you one day figure out how to get your life together." Laughter erupted immediately. It was not polite or subdued laughter. It was loud barking and intentionally cruel. Uncle Calvin laughed the hardest. He sat at the head of the table wearing a bespoke suit that strained against his wide frame. He wiped a tear of amusement from his eye and shook his head. Uncle Calvin picked up the thick leather check folio the waiter had just dropped off. He did not even open it. He simply slid it straight down the polished wood table until it stopped directly in front of my plate. "Consider it rent for sitting at the grown-ups table?" Maya, Uncle Calvin said, his voice booming with arrogant authority. "The bill is $4,200. Liam here just closed a massive commercial real estate deal, and your sister deserves to celebrate in style. We all know you are just scraping by at whatever little assistant job you managed to keep this month. So you can cover the tip, or you can cover the whole thing. Call it an investment in being around successful people." I looked down at the leather folio. $4,200. They had ordered 3 bottles of vintage wine, multiple tomahawk steaks, and towers of imported seafood. I had eaten a side salad. Liam chuckled and set his bourbon glass down. He leaned across the table, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an expression of performative sympathy. "Listen, Maya, if you are short on cash, my property management firm is actually looking for a new receptionist. It is minimum wage, sure, but it beats that dump you currently rent. Plus, being around a real corporate environment might teach you a thing or two about ambition. Chloe always says you lack drive. I am just trying to help family out." I stared at Liam. This was the dynamic they had meticulously crafted and fiercely protected. They worshipped Liam and his perceived status as a hyper-wealthy real estate mogul. They coddled Chloe, treating her like royalty simply by virtue of her marriage. And they used me as their designated loser, the scapegoat they could step on to make themselves feel taller. Ever since Uncle Calvin took over my late father's logistics company 10 years ago, he had made it his personal mission to erase my father's legacy and elevate himself as the self-made king of our family. He had handed my father's intended college fund for me directly to Chloe, claiming I lacked the intellect to utilize it properly. He had rewritten our family history, positioning himself as the savior, and me as the ungrateful burden. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my living situation. Arguing with them was like negotiating with a brick wall. Instead, I reached into my purse. "Are you going to cry, Maya?" Chloe taunted, leaning her chin on her hand. "Because if you cannot afford it, Liam can just pay it. He makes that much in an hour. We just thought it would be a nice gesture for you to finally contribute something to this family." I ignored her. I opened my wallet and pulled out a solid matte black titanium card. It had no numbers on the front, no flashy bank logos, just my name, etched cleanly into the heavy metal. I placed it inside the leather folio and closed it. Chloe rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might lose her balance. "Oh, please," she scoffed, pointing at the folio. "What is that? A prepaid debit card? A fake metal prop you bought online to look rich? Do not embarrass us, Maya. If that card declines, I swear I am never inviting you out in public again." "Let her try," Uncle Calvin said, crossing his arms over his chest. "When it bounces, she can go wash dishes in the back. It will build character." I pushed the leather folio toward the edge of the table, waiting for the server. My heart rate was completely steady. They had no idea who was sitting across from them. They had no idea that I did not work as an assistant. They had no idea that I did not need a minimum wage receptionist job at Liam's shell of a company. The waiter approached our table, his face a mask of professional courtesy. He picked up the folio and gave a tight nod. "I will be right back with your receipt." As he walked away, Liam smirked and wrapped an arm around Chloe's shoulders. "So Maya, about that receptionist job. I need an answer by Monday. I cannot hold the position forever. We require someone who knows how to answer phones without sounding incompetent. Think you can handle that?" I looked directly at Liam. "I think I can manage." Good Uncle Calvin boomed. "About time you learned the value of a hard day's work. Your father never understood business, Maya. He was soft. That is why his company was failing before I stepped in and saved it. I built an empire from the scraps he left behind. You should be taking notes from Liam and me." I kept my expression entirely neutral. Uncle Calvin's empire was a house of cards, and I was the wind. He did not know that his logistics company had secretly gone bankrupt 3 years ago. He did not know that a proxy investment firm had bought his debt out of pity, keeping him afloat, so he could continue parading around Atlanta in his custom suits. And he certainly did not know that I owned that proxy firm. We sat in tense silence for a few minutes. Chloe checked her reflection in her phone camera, complaining about the lighting in the restaurant. Liam checked his watch loudly, announcing how much his time was worth per minute. I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water. This was the moment I had waited years for. The moment when the illusion they had built to suffocate me would begin to crack. I had spent my entire 20s rebuilding what Calvin destroyed. I had skipped vacations, worked 18-hour days, and outmaneuvered every competitor in the commercial real estate sector. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, a private equity firm that practically owned half the downtown skyline. But to my family, I was still just Maya, the pathetic older sister who could not get her life together. The waiter returned, but his entire demeanor had changed. He looked pale, almost terrified, holding the leather folio with both hands as if it were a fragile artifact. He did not walk to the head of the table where Uncle Calvin sat. He walked directly to me. He bypassed Liam's outstretched hand and carefully placed the folio beside my water glass. He bowed deeply, a gesture so profound and out of place in a modern American steakhouse that the surrounding tables grew quiet. "Everything is processed, Ms. Caldwell." The waiter said, his voice trembling with sheer respect. "The owner of the restaurant sends his absolute best regards. He wanted me to personally inform you that your usual vehicle is waiting out back whenever you are ready to depart." Uncle Calvin's face turned an ugly shade of purple. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal glassware. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, glaring at the waiter. "Why are you bowing to a broke receptionist? She just paid a $4,000 bill with a fake piece of plastic. I demand to see the manager immediately." The waiter stood up straight, his expression hardening as he looked at my uncle. "I am the general manager, sir. And this woman's card is not fake. It is a titanium limitless account issued exclusively to our ownership group's top-tier investors. Now I suggest you lower your voice, or I will have security escort you off the premises." Chloe's mouth fell open. Liam froze, his hand suspended halfway to his bourbon glass. The arrogant smirks vanished from their faces, replaced by a sudden creeping confusion. I did not look at Uncle Calvin or Chloe. I picked up my black card, slipped it back into my wallet, and stood up from the table. I smoothed down my coat, looked at the manager, and offered a polite nod. "Thank you for the excellent service tonight," I said calmly. I turned my back on my family and walked away. I did not wait for their questions or their outrage. The heavy wooden doors of the restaurant opened for me, and I stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air. A sleek black Maybach was idling by the curb, the driver immediately rushing to open the rear door for me. I slid into the plush leather seat and watched through the tinted glass as the restaurant doors burst open. Liam stumbled out onto the sidewalk, completely ignoring my departure. He was staring at his phone screen in absolute panic. His face was drained of all color, his hands shaking violently as he scrolled through an email. I knew exactly what he was reading. His bank had just sent him a critical alert regarding his business accounts. A parent company had just flagged his primary commercial loan for immediate repayment due to breach of contract. That parent company was Vanguard Holdings. The dominoes were finally falling, and I had a front row seat to the destruction. Happy 35th birthday to our pathetic sister who still rents, my younger sister Chloe announced, tapping her crystal champagne flute with a silver dessert spoon. Venomous laughter filled the chandelier-lit private dining room. They mocked my supposed poverty, tossing a $4,000 steakhouse bill directly into my lap, completely unaware that they were carelessly spending my fortune. My fingers did not tremble with sorrow. They trembled with the electric thrill of a predator, watching its prey step willingly into a trap. Tonight I would pull the string that collapsed their entire fake empire. I am Maya Caldwell, 35 years old, and tonight was supposed to be a quiet family dinner to celebrate my birthday. Instead, it was an execution. We were seated at Prime 108, an exclusive and notoriously overpriced steakhouse in the heart of Atlanta. It was the kind of place where the lighting was intentionally dim and the steaks cost more than a car payment. The air smelled of aged beef truffles and the heavy cologne of men trying too hard to impress each other. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water, watching the people who shared my blood treat me like an unwanted charity case. Chloe, my 28-year-old sister, stood near the head of the table. She smoothed down her custom silk dress, a garment funded entirely by the man sitting next to her, and raised her glass higher. She repeated her toast, making sure her voice carried to the neighboring tables. Let us toast to Maya, 35 years old, still living in that cramped apartment and still figuring it out. May you one day find a fraction of the ambition the rest of us share. The chorus of laughter from my aunts, cousins, and uncles was immediate and sharp, but the loudest laugh belonged to Uncle Calvin. He sat squarely at the head of the table, his wide frame testing the seams of a custom-tailored suit. Uncle Calvin wiped a tear of pure amusement from his cheek and gestured to the waiter. When the waiter handed him the thick leather check folio, Uncle Calvin did not even bother opening it. He simply slid it forcefully down the polished wood surface. It stopped right against my water glass. Consider it rent for sitting at the grown-ups table tonight. Maya, Uncle Calvin said, his voice carrying the booming arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. The bill is $4,200. Liam here just closed a massive commercial real estate deal, and your sister deserves to celebrate properly. We all know you are just scraping by at whatever little assistant job you managed to keep this month. Pay the tip or pay the whole thing, but it is time you pulled your weight. I looked down at the black leather folio. $4,200. Our table was covered in the remnants of their gluttony. Empty oyster shells stacked high on crushed ice. Half-eaten cuts of Wagyu beef resting in pools of rich sauce. 4 empty bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon that I knew cost at least $400 each. I had ordered a simple house salad and tap water. They had ordered with reckless abandon, knowing full well they intended to ambush me with the check. It was a calculated cruelty, a power play designed to humiliate me on the very day I was born. This was their favorite game. When my father passed away unexpectedly 15 years ago, I was just 20 years old. Uncle Calvin swooped in with a team of lawyers, exploiting legal loopholes and confusing my grieving mother into signing over the controlling shares of my father's successful logistics company. Calvin claimed the company was drowning in hidden debt and that he was taking on a massive burden to save our family name. In reality, he liquidated the most valuable assets, kept the massive profits, and used the remaining corporate shell to fund his lavish lifestyle. Chloe, being the youngest and most pliable, was quickly bought off with designer bags and the college fund that was supposed to be split equally between us. She became Calvin's loyal parrot, eager to agree with whatever he said, as long as the money kept flowing. Calvin rewrote our family history, elevating himself as a self-made king and casting me as the bitter, ungrateful burden because I was the only one who questioned him. The real star of their delusion, however, was sitting right next to Chloe. Liam was 32 white and carried himself with the smug entitlement of a man playing the wealthy savior to a black family, desperate for high society validation. He leaned back in his tufted leather chair, swirling his expensive bourbon with a practiced smirk. Chloe had met him at a charity gala 3 years ago. He drove a leased European sports car, wore watches that cost more than my supposed annual salary, and spoke entirely in aggressive business buzzwords. My family, desperate to secure their place in Atlanta's elite circles, practically worshipped the ground he walked on. The fact that he was white only added to Calvin's twisted sense of having finally arrived in the upper echelons of society. They viewed Liam as the ultimate prize, a wealthy mogul who validated their status. In return, Liam reveled in the worship. He loved having a built-in audience of sycophants, and he especially loved having a designated failure in the family to look down upon. That failure was always me. "Listen, Maya," Liam said, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an expression of deeply insulting pity. "If you are short on cash, my property management firm is actually looking for a new receptionist. It is minimum wage, sure, but it beats that rundown dump you currently rent. Plus, being around a real corporate environment might teach you a thing or two about ambition. Chloe always says you lack drive. I am just trying to help family out." I stared at Liam, letting the silence stretch between us. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my living situation. Arguing with delusions is a waste of breath. They worshipped his perceived status and used his fake prestige as a weapon to isolate and humiliate me at every family gathering. They had no idea who was sitting across from them. They had no idea that I did not work as a struggling assistant. They had no idea that Liam's entire real estate empire was a fragile house of cards drowning in high-interest predatory debt. And they certainly did not know that I was the wind about to blow it all down. I had spent my entire days quietly building a commercial real estate firm from the ground up, moving in the shadows, acquiring assets and making ruthless moves while they paraded around Atlanta playing rich. I owned the company that held Liam by the throat. "Are you going to cry?" Maya, Chloe taunted, resting her chin on her manicured hand. "Because if you cannot afford it, Liam can just cover it. He makes that much in a single hour. We just thought it would be a nice gesture for you to finally contribute something useful to this family, instead of just taking up space." I kept my posture perfectly relaxed. I calmly reached into my leather handbag and opened my wallet. I bypassed the standard colorful debit cards that regular people carry. Instead, I pulled out a solid matte black titanium card. It had no numbers on the front, no flashy bank logos, just my name, etched cleanly into the heavy metal. I placed it quietly inside the leather folio and closed the cover. Chloe scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes with theatrical exaggeration. "Oh, please," she laughed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the folio. "What is that? A prepaid debit card? A fake metal prop you bought online to look rich? Do not embarrass us, Maya. If that card declines, I swear I am never inviting you out in public again." "Let her try," Uncle Calvin added, crossing his massive arms and leaning back in his chair. "When it bounces, she can go wash dishes in the back. It will build character. Your father was too soft on you, Maya. That is why his business was failing before I generously stepped in and saved it. You should be taking notes from Liam and me tonight instead of trying to play dress-up." I simply took a slow sip of my water. I did not need to defend my bank account. The truth was about to arrive on a silver platter. I watched the waiter approach our table to collect the folio, completely oblivious to the impending explosion. He picked up the leather booklet with a polite nod and walked away toward the payment terminals. Liam went back to boasting about his latest commercial acquisition, a building I knew for a fact he was already 3 months behind on payments for. Chloe leaned into his shoulder, hanging on to his every word. Uncle Calvin signaled for the sommelier to bring another bottle of expensive wine, confident that he had successfully ruined my birthday. They were all so comfortable in their cruelty, so absolutely certain of their superiority. They had spent 15 years making sure I stayed at the bottom, entirely unaware that I had already bought the ground they were standing on. The waiter had barely taken 2 steps away from our table with the leather folio when a man in a sharp charcoal suit intercepted him. It was the restaurant's general manager, a man who usually only emerged from the back office to greet visiting politicians or elite celebrities. He snatched the leather booklet from the waiter's hands, glanced inside at the black titanium card, and immediately pivoted toward our table. His pace was urgent, his expression a mix of sheer panic and absolute reverence. He bypassed Uncle Calvin completely. He ignored Liam, who had his hand casually outstretched, expecting the receipt to mock me with. Instead, the manager walked directly to my end of the table. He did not just hand the card back to me. He stopped, straightened his posture, and bowed deeply. "Everything is perfectly processed," Miss Caldwell, the manager, said, his voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the background. "The restaurant owner sends his absolute best regards and apologizes that he could not be here to greet you himself. Your usual vehicle has been pulled around to the private rear exit whenever you are ready to depart." The silence at the table was so profound it was almost deafening. Chloe's champagne glass halted halfway to her mouth. Liam's smug smile froze, his outstretched hand slowly dropping back to the table. Uncle Calvin was the first to recover from the shock. His face turned a deep, volatile shade of plum. He slammed his heavy fist onto the mahogany table, making the fine crystal glassware rattle. "What is the meaning of this?" Calvin demanded, glaring fiercely at the manager. "Why are you bowing to a broke receptionist? She just tried to pay a $4,000 bill with a fake piece of metal. I demand you run that card again, or I will call the police for fraud." The manager stood up straight, his polite demeanor hardening into a wall of professional ice as he looked down at my uncle. "Sir, I strongly advise you to lower your voice. That card is a solid titanium limitless account issued exclusively to our hospitality group's top-tier investors. The meal has been paid for in full, including a gratuity that exceeds the entire cost of your dinner. If you continue to cause a disturbance, I will have my security team escort you off the premises." I did not wait for Uncle Calvin to sputter out a response. I did not look at Chloe's pale, shocked face or Liam's sudden nervous sweating. I simply picked up my card, slid it back into my wallet, and stood up. I adjusted my silk evening coat, offered the manager a polite nod of thanks, and turned my back on the people who shared my blood. I walked away without saying a single word to them. I did not need to. The silence I left in my wake was far more devastating than any argument I could have made. As I stepped out of the private rear exit into the cool Atlanta night air, my driver was already holding the door of my black Maybach open. I slid into the plush leather seat and instructed him to wait just a moment. Through the heavily tinted glass, I watched the front entrance of the restaurant. Less than a minute later, Liam stumbled out onto the sidewalk. He had completely abandoned Chloe and Calvin inside. He was staring at his phone screen, his face illuminated by the harsh white light of the display. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His hands were shaking so violently, he almost dropped the device. He had just received a critical alert from his bank. A major commercial loan that kept his fraudulent property management firm afloat had just been flagged for immediate repayment due to a sudden breach of contract clause. The parent company that held his debt had triggered the recall. That parent company was Vanguard Holdings. I smiled, tapped the glass partition, and told my driver to take me home. The first domino had officially fallen. The retaliation came less than 12 hours later. At 9 o'clock the next morning, my phone buzzed with a demanding text from Aunt Denise. I was summoned to her house for an immediate family meeting. Aunt Denise's spacious suburban living room was the traditional staging ground for our family interventions, the place where Calvin liked to hold court and dictate the lives of everyone beneath him. I arrived wearing a tailored emerald green suit, carrying a designer briefcase that cost more than my supposed monthly rent. When I walked into the living room, the ambush was already set. Uncle Calvin stood by the fireplace, practically vibrating with rage. Chloe sat on the velvet sofa, her arms crossed tight against her chest, looking deeply offended. Liam paced back and forth near the windows, chewing nervously on his thumbnail. He looked exhausted, likely having spent the entire night trying to figure out why his bank was suddenly threatening to seize his assets. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here looking so pleased with yourself," Calvin shouted before I even had the chance to sit down. "You deliberately humiliated Liam last night. You pulled some kind of sick stunt with a stolen credit card to make yourself look important. You have always been bitter, Maya. Ever since I took over your daddy's firm and gave Chloe the college fund, you have been trying to tear this family apart out of pure jealousy. I stood near the entryway, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. It was almost funny how easily Calvin rewrote history to make himself the victim. He had not taken over my father's firm to save it. He had hijacked it while my mother was grieving, siphoned the profits to buy his massive house, and left me with nothing. Chloe jumped in, pointing an accusing finger at me. You ruined my husband's celebration. Liam was so generous to offer you a job and you spit in his face. You are just a pathetic liar, Maya. You probably maxed out a dozen credit cards just to pull that trick at the restaurant. Liam finally stopped pacing. He walked over to the glass coffee table and picked up a thick legal document. He sneered, trying to regain the arrogant swagger he had displayed the night before, though his eyes betrayed his underlying panic. He slid the document forcefully across the glass until it stopped in front of me. You want to play games? Maya, Liam said, his voice dripping with condescension. Let us play. My property management firm just bought the building you live in. We took ownership yesterday afternoon. You have been a disruptive tenant, and I am exercising my right as the new owner. This is your official 30-day eviction notice. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your cheap apartment and get out. He leaned closer, resting his hands on the table. However, since I am a generous man, I am willing to offer you a deal. If you apologize to Chloe right now, beg your Uncle Calvin for forgiveness, and sign over your remaining 10% share of your late grandmother's estate to my wife, I will grant you a month-to-month lease. You sign this paper agreeing to our terms, or you are out on the street. The room went completely silent. Calvin crossed his arms, smiling proudly at Liam's ruthless tactic. Chloe looked smug, waiting for me to break down and cry. They expected me to panic. They expected me to beg for my home. I looked down at the eviction notice. I noticed the corporate letterhead at the top of the page. Liam's company was a minor subsidiary, a tiny shell corporation that fed into a larger financial ecosystem. An ecosystem I completely controlled. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a gold-plated fountain pen. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my dignity. I simply leaned over the glass table and signed my name on the bottom line of his ridiculous extortion document. Chloe laughed softly. That is what I thought, she mocked. Always submitting when someone puts you in your place. But I was not finished. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a heavy miniature steel corporate stamp. I placed it directly over my signature and pressed down firmly, leaving a crisp embossed seal on the legal document. I picked up the paper and handed it directly to Liam. You should really pay closer attention to who funds your acquisitions, Liam, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Liam snatched the paper from my hand. He looked down at my signature, ready to mock me further, but his eyes caught the embossed seal. He froze. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might pass out right there in Aunt Denise's living room. He stared at the stamp, reading the clear raised lettering of the corporate entity that had just authorized the document. Vanguard Holdings. What is this? Liam choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could answer, Liam's phone began to ring frantically in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out, looking at the caller ID. It was his chief financial officer. The panic in his eyes was undeniable. He answered the phone, pressing it to his ear with a trembling hand. He did not say a word. He just listened as the voice on the other end delivered the catastrophic news. The parent company that held all of his predatory debt had just accelerated the foreclosure process on his entire portfolio. Calvin, completely oblivious to Liam's internal collapse, stepped directly into my personal space. He pointed a thick, heavy finger right in my face. You are nothing in this city, Maya. Calvin growled, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigars. You will always be at the bottom of this family. Do not ever think you can outsmart me or the empire I built. I did not flinch. I looked Uncle Calvin dead in the eye, stepped smoothly around his pointed finger, and moved toward the front door. I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob and looked back over my shoulder. You should really check the mortgage on your own house, Uncle, I whispered, ensuring the words carried clearly across the quiet room. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me with a decisive click. I left Calvin standing confused by the fireplace, and Liam hyperventilating in the hallway, his fake empire crumbling to dust in his hands. The morning sun had barely crested the Atlanta skyline when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I did not need to check the screen to know who was demanding my attention. It was a text message from Aunt Denise summoning me to her suburban home for an immediate family meeting. Aunt Denise lived in a sprawling, outdated brick house that had long served as the traditional staging ground for our family interventions. It was the place where Uncle Calvin liked to hold court, sitting in his oversized leather recliner while he dictated the lives and finances of everyone beneath him. I took my time getting ready. I chose a tailored emerald green suit that projected absolute authority and carried a leather briefcase containing the financial documents that would soon dismantle their entire reality. When I walked through the heavy wooden front doors of Aunt Denise's house, the ambush was already set. The living room smelled heavily of artificial vanilla plug-ins and misplaced arrogance. Uncle Calvin stood aggressively by the stone fireplace, his wide frame vibrating with suppressed rage. Chloe sat on a plush velvet sofa, her arms crossed tight against her chest, her face fixed in a deeply offended pout. Liam paced back and forth near the large bay windows. I was chewing nervously on his thumbnail, and the dark circles under his blue eyes suggested he had not slept a single minute since receiving that critical bank alert outside the steakhouse the night before. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here, looking so pleased with yourself," Maya, Uncle Calvin shouted before I even had the chance to sit down. He took a heavy step toward me, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "You deliberately humiliated Liam last night in front of the entire restaurant. You pulled some kind of sick, desperate stunt with a stolen credit card just to make yourself look important. We had to spend 20 minutes apologizing to the general manager for your erratic behavior." I stood near the entryway, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. I rested both hands on my briefcase and simply watched him yell. It was almost funny how easily Calvin rewrote history to make himself the victim. He had spent his entire life projecting a narrative of superiority while feeding off the scraps of my family. "You have always been bitter," Maya Calvin continued, his voice rising in volume as he paced the floral rug. "Ever since your father passed away, and I had to step in to take over his logistics firm, you have been trying to tear this family down. I saved that company. I gave Chloe the college fund because I knew she actually had a future, and you have been jealous of her success ever since. You are a toxic presence in this family." I let his words wash over me without flinching. He had not taken over my father's firm to save it. He had hijacked it while my mother was grieving, siphoning the profits to buy his massive house and his custom suits, leaving me with absolutely nothing to pay for my own education. He had bought Chloe's loyalty with my money, turning her into his personal cheerleader. I knew the truth, and I knew that his stolen empire had secretly gone bankrupt 3 years ago. Chloe jumped into the conversation, pointing an accusing manicured finger at me. "You ruined my husband's celebration, Maya. Liam was being so generous to offer you a job at his property firm, and you spit right in his face. You are just a pathetic liar. You probably maxed out a dozen high-interest credit cards just to pull that fake wealthy trick at the restaurant." Liam finally stopped pacing by the window. He walked over to the glass coffee table in the center of the room and picked up a thick legal document. He sneered, trying desperately to regain the arrogant swagger he had displayed the night before, though his trembling hands betrayed his underlying panic. He slid the document forcefully across the glass table until it stopped right in front of me. "You want to play games?" Maya Liam said, his voice dripping with forced condescension. "Let us play. My property management firm just bought the building you live in. We took full ownership yesterday afternoon. You have been a disruptive and undesirable tenant, and I am exercising my legal right as the new owner. This is your official 30-day eviction notice. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your cheap apartment and get out." He leaned closer, resting his hands heavily on the table, trying to tower over me. "However, since I am a generous man, I am willing to offer you a deal. If you apologize to Chloe right now, beg your Uncle Calvin for forgiveness, and sign over your remaining percentage of your late grandmother's estate. To my wife, I will grant you a month-to-month lease. You sign this paper agreeing to our terms, or you are out on the street by the end of the month." The room went completely silent. Aunt Denise watched from the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. Uncle Calvin smiled proudly at Liam's ruthless tactic, clearly thrilled that the white brother-in-law was putting me in my place. Chloe looked incredibly smug, waiting for me to break down, cry, and beg for my home. They fully expected me to panic. They expected me to surrender the last piece of my dignity just to keep a roof over my head. I looked down at the eviction notice resting on the glass table. I noticed the corporate letterhead printed boldly at the top of the page. Liam's company was a minor struggling subsidiary, a tiny shell corporation that fed into a much larger financial ecosystem. It was an ecosystem I completely controlled. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or try to defend my dignity. Arguing with fools only drags you down to their level. I calmly reached into my suit pocket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I leaned over the glass table and signed my name on the bottom line of his ridiculous extortion document with smooth, deliberate strokes. Chloe laughed softly from the sofa. That is exactly what I thought, she mocked, her voice full of poison. You always submit when someone finally puts you in your proper place. But I was not finished. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a small, heavy steel corporate stamp. I placed the metal base directly over my fresh signature and pressed down with all my weight. The mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet living room. I lifted the tool, leaving a crisp, deeply embossed corporate seal permanently pressed into the legal document. I picked up the paper and handed it directly to Liam. You should really pay closer attention to who funds your acquisitions. Liam, I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. Liam snatched the paper from my hand. He looked down at my signature, opening his mouth to mock me further. But his eyes caught the embossed seal. He froze completely. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like he might pass out right there on Aunt Denise's floral rug. He stared at the stamp, reading the clear raised lettering of the corporate entity that had just authorized the document. Vanguard Holdings. What is this? Liam choked out, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Before I could answer, Liam's phone began to ring frantically in his jacket pocket. The loud, obnoxious ringtone shattered the silence. He pulled the phone out, staring at the caller identification. It was his chief financial officer. The sheer panic in Liam's eyes was undeniable. He answered the phone, pressing it to his ear with a violently trembling hand. He did not say a single word. He just listened as the voice on the other end delivered catastrophic news. The parent company that held all of his predatory debt, the company he relied on to survive, had just accelerated the foreclosure process on his entire portfolio. He realized in real time that the woman standing in front of him was his executioner. Uncle Calvin, completely oblivious to Liam's internal collapse and the reality of the signatures, stepped directly into my personal space. He pointed a thick, heavy finger right in my face, his anger flaring up again. You are nothing in this city, Maya, Calvin growled, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigars. You will always be at the bottom of this family. Do not ever think you can outsmart me or the empire I built with my own 2 hands. You are a nobody. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I looked Uncle Calvin dead in the eye, stepped smoothly around his pointed finger, and moved toward the front door. I paused with my hand resting on the cool brass doorknob and looked back over my shoulder at the man who had stolen my father's legacy. Check your own mortgage, Uncle, I whispered, ensuring the words carried clearly and sharply across the quiet room. I walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me with a decisive, heavy click. I walked down the driveway toward my waiting car, leaving Calvin standing utterly confused by the fireplace and Liam hyperventilating in the hallway as his entire fake empire crumbled to dust in his hands. The heavy oak door of Aunt Denise's house clicked shut behind me, severing the shouting and chaos I left in the living room. I walked down the paved driveway toward my waiting car, with my head held high and my posture perfectly straight. The morning air felt incredibly crisp. For 15 years I had walked out of that house feeling diminished, carrying the weight of their relentless insults and emotional abuse. Today I left them suffocating under the heavy weight of their own debt. My driver quickly opened the rear door of the black Maybach. I slid into the quiet leather interior and gave a simple instruction to head to the office. As we pulled away from the manicured suburban lawns, I let out a long, slow breath. The trap had been set, the bait had been taken, and the jaws were finally snapping shut. 20 minutes later, my car pulled up to the sleek glass facade of the Vanguard Tower in downtown Atlanta. I did not work in a cramped cubicle or fetch coffee for arrogant middle managers. I owned the building. I stepped through the revolving glass doors into the sprawling marble lobby. The security team at the front desk immediately stood up straighter, offering polite, respectful greetings as I walked past. I bypassed the main bank of elevators and used my keycard to access the private express lift reserved exclusively for executive ownership. The stainless steel doors slid shut and the elevator shot upward to the penthouse level. The doors opened directly into my private suite. The space was a fortress of modern power featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city skyline. Sitting at my massive mahogany desk was Elias, my chief corporate attorney and my most trusted confidant. Elias was a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who had helped me navigate the complex financial webs required to corner my uncle. He looked up from a stack of financial portfolios and offered a razor-sharp smile. He already knew about the morning events. "The bank just confirmed Liam's panic," Elias said, sliding a polished tablet across the desk toward me. "He has been desperately trying to reach our financial officers for the past hour. He is begging for a grace period on the commercial loans we just recalled." I took a seat in my leather chair and looked at the flashing red numbers on the screen. "Let him sweat," I replied calmly. He built his fake real estate empire on high-interest predatory loans, actively funneling money from Uncle Calvin to keep up appearances. Now that Vanguard Holdings owns that debt, we are calling in every single cent. He has exactly 48 hours before we seize his assets. Elias nodded, pulling up a second file on the tablet. "And what about Calvin?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the man who had stolen my father's legacy. When my dad died, his logistics company was highly profitable. Calvin used my mother's heavy grief and shady legal loopholes to strip her of her shares. He liquidated the best assets to buy his luxury cars, his country club memberships, and his massive suburban house. He ran the rest of the company straight into the ground. 5 years ago, when Calvin quietly filed for bankruptcy to hide his massive failures, I used Vanguard Holdings as a proxy to buy his debt for pennies on the dollar. Calvin had no idea that for the past 5 years, the faceless corporate entity keeping him out of federal prison was owned by the niece. He mocked relentlessly. "Initiate the foreclosure on Calvin's entire estate," I instructed Elias. "I own the mortgage on the house he sleeps in. I own the lease on the cars he drives. I even own the credit line he used to buy the custom suit he wore to dinner last night. I want everything locked down by tomorrow evening." Before Elias could confirm the orders, the secure intercom on my desk buzzed loudly. My head of security spoke through the speaker, his voice tight with barely concealed annoyance. "Ms. Caldwell, I apologize for the interruption. There is a highly agitated woman in the lobby. She does not have an appointment, but she is screaming at the front desk, demanding to speak to the manager of the receptionist. She says she is your sister." Elias raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the sheer audacity. Chloe had actually tracked me down. She must have seen the Vanguard Holdings logo on the eviction notice and assumed I was a low-level employee there. She had come to get me fired. "Send her up to the penthouse," I told security, "but send 2 guards up with her." I stood up and walked over to the massive conference room attached to my office. The room was separated by smart glass panels that were currently frosted over for privacy. I told Elias and my 2 senior vice presidents to wait inside the conference room and observe. A moment later, the private elevator doors chimed open. Chloe stormed into my office, flanked by 2 massive security guards who looked ready to tackle her. She was breathing heavily, her face flushed red with unhinged anger. She wore designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair and carried a handbag that Liam had bought with my money. She looked around the multi-million-dollar penthouse suite, her eyes widening slightly at the expensive modern art and the panoramic views. But her pure arrogance quickly overrode her confusion. She assumed I was trespassing in my boss's office, or worse, sleeping with an executive to get access. "Pack your desk right now!" Maya Chloe screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I just spent 20 minutes yelling at your human resources department downstairs. I told them you stole from my husband and forged company documents to fake an eviction notice. You are completely psychotic and you are fired. I am going to make sure you never work in this city again. I stood behind my desk completely unfazed by her tantrum. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to explain or defend myself. I simply reached out and pressed a small silver button on my control console. Instantly, the electrical current in the smart glass walls shifted. The frosted panels separating my office from the conference room turned completely transparent. Chloe stopped yelling. Her mouth hung open as she stared through the clear glass. Inside the room, Elias and a team of high-level executives were sitting around a massive table looking directly at her with expressions of sheer pity and disgust. They had heard every single word of her ridiculous outburst. Chloe slowly turned her attention back to me. She looked at the heavy mahogany desk. She looked at the expensive tailored suit I was wearing. She looked at the solid gold nameplate resting perfectly in the center of the workspace. It read, Maya Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Her knees visibly buckled and she had to grab the back of a guest leather chair to steady herself. The sister she had mocked all her life, the woman she thought was a struggling, pathetic loser, was the absolute ruler of this financial fortress. You cannot fire the owner of the building, Chloe. I said, my voice carrying the quiet, devastating weight of total authority. But I can certainly evict a tenant. Your husband has bankrupted your future to play pretend. You are broke. And as of this morning, you are officially homeless. Panic and pure humiliation washed over Chloe's face, quickly followed by a desperate, cornered rage. She could not process the fact that she was no longer the golden child. She refused to accept that her entire luxury life was funded by my mercy. You are going to regret this, Chloe shrieked, tears of pure frustration spilling down her cheeks. You think you have won, but you are nothing. Liam is hosting a $100,000 charity gala tomorrow night at the Plaza Hotel. Uncle Calvin is giving a speech to the most important investors in the state. He is officially announcing Liam as the sole heir to the family business. We are going to ruin you. You are permanently cut out of this family. I nodded to the security guards. They stepped forward, taking Chloe firmly by the arms. She kicked and screamed obscenities as they dragged her backward toward the elevator doors. I watched her disappear behind the closing steel panels, her loud voice completely cut off from my sanctuary. The office fell blissfully silent once again. Elias stepped out of the conference room, adjusting his suit jacket. He looked at me, waiting for my next command. Cancel my flight to London, I told him, picking up my tablet. And clear my entire schedule for tomorrow evening. I have a charity gala to attend. Then I authorized a massive immediate wire transfer from my private accounts. I was not just going to attend their prestigious event. I was going to buy the hotel hosting it. The polished steel doors of my private elevator slid open with a soft chime. Chloe marched out, her designer heels sinking heavily into the plush carpets of the penthouse lobby. Two massive security guards flanked her, their expressions tense and alert, clearly ready to physically restrain her if she became violent. Chloe ignored them completely. She was practically vibrating with rage, her face flushed an angry red and her breathing heavy and erratic. She wore a pristine white silk blouse and clutched a quilted leather handbag. Luxury items I knew perfectly well Liam had purchased using lines of credit I ultimately controlled. Chloe stormed through the double glass doors of my primary office suite and stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted around the massive room, taking in the original modern art hanging on the walls, the custom mahogany furniture, and the breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline stretching out behind my desk. For a split second, sheer confusion crossed her face. The environment did not match the narrative she held in her head. But her deeply ingrained arrogance quickly overrode any logical thought. Her mind simply could not process the reality in front of her, so she immediately constructed a fiction that fit her narrow worldview. She assumed I was a low-level assistant, trespassing in a superior's office, or perhaps using the space while the real boss was away. Pack up your desk right this second, Maya! Chloe screamed, her voice shrill and echoing harshly off the high ceilings. What are you even doing up here? Did you sneak into your boss's office just to pretend you are important? You are completely psychotic. I just spent 20 minutes downstairs yelling at your human resources department in the main lobby. I demanded to speak to the manager of whatever little receptionist pool you belong to. I told them exactly what kind of thief they hired. I told them you stole a corporate stamp from one of the executives and used it to forge a fake eviction notice to threaten my husband. You are fired, Maya. You are entirely done in this city. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of defense. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, resting my hands neatly on the polished surface of my desk. I let her scream. I let her exhaust her lungs and dig her own grave. The security guards shifted uncomfortably near the entrance, waiting for my signal to intervene and remove her, but I held up a single hand to keep them back. I wanted to hear every single word she had to say. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her misplaced confidence before I crushed it. You have always been a jealous parasite. Chloe continued, stomping forward and slamming her hands down on the edge of my mahogany desk. You could never stand the fact that Liam is a real success while you are just a failure. Uncle Calvin was right about you from the very beginning. He knew you would end up a bitter loser, which is why he made sure the family legacy went to me and Liam. We are the future of this family. You think faking a piece of paper is going to scare us? Liam is a millionaire. We own commercial properties you could not even dream of cleaning. You are going to federal prison for corporate fraud, Maya. Chloe stood there, panting heavily, a smug and victorious smile spreading across her face. She truly believed she had won. She believed she had just orchestrated my ultimate professional downfall and secured her position as the untouchable golden child. I looked at her with pure, unadulterated pity. Then, without breaking eye contact for even a fraction of a second, I reached out and pressed a small silver button recessed into my desk console. A soft hum vibrated through the room. Instantly, the electrical current running through the smart glass wall to my left shifted. The opaque frosted panels separating my main office from the executive conference room turned completely transparent. Chloe gasped and took a sudden frightened step backward. Inside the massive conference room, Elias and 4 of my top senior vice presidents were seated around a long marble table. They were not reviewing documents or holding a meeting. They were all looking directly through the glass at Chloe. Their expressions ranged from sheer disbelief to profound disgust. They had heard every single word of her unhinged screaming tantrum through the office audio feed. Chloe stared at the group of elite corporate executives, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, suffocating on dry land. The smugness vanished from her face, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. She slowly turned her head back toward me. Her eyes finally took in the details she had willfully ignored in her blind rage. She looked at my impeccably tailored suit. She looked at the heavy gold pen resting near my hand. And finally, she looked at the solid brass nameplate positioned perfectly in the center of the desk. It read, Maya Caldwell, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The color drained entirely from her face, her knees visibly buckled, and she had to grip the back of a leather guest chair just to remain standing. The sister she had mocked her entire life. The woman she thought was a struggling receptionist waiting to be fired was the absolute ruler of this financial empire. You cannot fire the owner of the building, Chloe, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried the devastating weight of total authority. But I can certainly evict a delinquent tenant. I did not forge that document. Your husband bankrupted your future playing pretend. He is a massive fraud. He built his fake real estate portfolio using predatory loans that he cannot possibly pay back. And as of yesterday morning, Vanguard Holdings bought every single one of his debts. You are broke, Chloe. And you are officially homeless. Pure panic washed over her features, quickly followed by a desperate cornered rage. Her mind refused to accept that her golden child status had been permanently revoked. She refused to believe that the luxury life she flaunted was entirely funded by my mercy and that my mercy had just run out. You are going to regret this! Chloe shrieked, hot tears of frustration and terror spilling down her cheeks. You think you have won, but you are nothing. Liam is hosting a $100,000 charity gala tomorrow night at the Plaza Hotel. The most powerful investors in the state will be there. Uncle Calvin is giving the keynote speech, and he is officially announcing Liam as the sole heir to the entire family business. You cannot touch us. We are going to ruin you publicly. You are permanently cut out of this family. I simply nodded to the security guards. They stepped forward, taking Chloe firmly by the arms. She thrashed and screamed obscenities as they dragged her backward across the carpet and toward the elevator doors. I watched her disappear behind the closing steel panels, her shrieking voice abruptly cut off from my sanctuary. The office fell blissfully silent once again. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid shut, completely severing the frantic echoes of my sister's screaming. The penthouse office returned to a state of absolute pristine silence. Only the faint, steady hum of the climate control system and the distant muffled sounds of the Atlanta traffic far below reminded me that the world outside was still turning. I stood by my mahogany desk, smoothing the front of my emerald green suit. I did not feel a sudden rush of adrenaline. I did not feel the need to pop a bottle of champagne or celebrate my sister's humiliating departure. Anger and gloating are emotions reserved for people who lack real control. I had total control. I turned to look at Elias. My chief corporate attorney stepped out of the executive conference room, casually adjusting his silver tie clip. His team of vice presidents had already returned to their respective workstations, recognizing that the theatrical interruption was over and millions of dollars still needed to be managed. Elias walked across the plush carpet and offered a slight knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement of the sheer chaos that had just departed my sanctuary. "We do not get mad, Elias," I said, pulling out my heavy leather chair and taking my seat at the head of the financial empire I had built from the ground up. "We get to work." Elias took the guest chair opposite my desk, resting his tablet on the polished wood surface. I unlocked my primary desktop terminal. The glowing financial dashboards reflected sharply across the dark mahogany, displaying the massive flow of capital moving through Vanguard Holdings. "First things first," I told him, keeping my voice steady and surgical. "Cancel my flight to London. I am not leaving the country this week. I need to be right here in Atlanta for the fallout." Elias tapped his screen, immediately voiding my international travel itinerary without a single question. "Done," he confirmed. "What is our next strategic move regarding your brother-in-law? He is currently bleeding out, but we still hold the blade." I pulled up the comprehensive debt portfolio we had quietly acquired from Liam's desperate creditors over the past 6 months. Liam's entire identity was built on the illusion of being a hyper-wealthy real estate mogul. In reality, he operated a fragile network of worthless paper shell companies, holding overvalued commercial leases, funded by incredibly toxic high-interest loans. He was already panicking over the initial default warning I triggered earlier that morning, but I wanted to leave him with absolutely no oxygen left to breathe. "Execute the final phase of the acquisition," I instructed, tracing the red deficit lines on my monitor. "I want the official foreclosure notices filed on every single one of his remaining shell companies. Seize the property management firm. Lock down his operating accounts. But do not serve the final papers to him today. Hold the physical service until tomorrow evening. Time the delivery perfectly for 8 o'clock. I want his phone blowing up with catastrophic legal notices exactly when he steps into that ballroom." Elias smiled, revealing a sharp, predatory look that perfectly matched my own internal rhythm. "Consider his entire empire liquidated," he replied softly. "By tomorrow night, the only thing he will own is the suit on his back, and even that was likely purchased on credit we now control." Just as Elias stood up to leave the office and execute the orders, my personal cell phone buzzed against the hard surface of my desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from Uncle Calvin. I picked the phone up, fully expecting a furious demand for an explanation about Liam's frozen accounts or Chloe's tearful recounting of her humiliation. Instead, I found a message dripping with pure, unadulterated ignorance. Chloe clearly had not told them the truth about what she saw in my office. Her fragile ego simply could not handle the reality of my position. The thought of admitting that the sister she had mocked her entire life was actually a corporate titan was too painful for her to process. So she had returned to her husband and my uncle with the comfortable lie she had initially fabricated in her own mind. She must have told them she successfully got me fired by screaming at human resources. I read Calvin's message aloud to Elias, my voice laced with dark amusement. "Chloe just told me you were escorted out of your building by security today. It is a damn shame you threw away your little assistant job just because you could not control your bitter jealousy. Do not even think about showing up to the charity gala tomorrow night." You are an embarrassment to this family, and security at the hotel already has your photograph with strict orders to keep you out. I set the phone down and let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was astounding. Calvin was so blinded by his own towering arrogance that he could not see the massive shadow looming right above him. He honestly believed he was a powerful king protecting his castle, completely unaware that the walls were already caving in around him. He needed me to be the designated failure so badly that he accepted Chloe's ridiculous lie without a second thought. I picked up my phone to type my response. I kept it incredibly brief, painfully polite, and absolutely deadly. I would not miss your final speech for the world. Uncle, I replied, hitting send before he could even begin to process the ominous meaning behind my words. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked back at Elias. He was pausing at the door, waiting for my final directive for the day. Tell me about the Plaza Hotel, I said, referencing the luxurious historic venue hosting their highly publicized charity gala tomorrow night. Elias did not miss a single beat. His encyclopedic knowledge of Atlanta's commercial real estate market was exactly why I paid him 7 figures a year. It is a premier property, he stated clearly. But the current ownership group has been quietly bleeding capital. They are looking for a highly motivated buyer to offload their domestic hospitality assets. They want a fast, discreet cash sale, but no one in the city has the liquid capital to close it within their time frame. I opened my private banking portal on my secure terminal. The screen displayed liquid reserves that Uncle Calvin and Liam could not comprehend in their wildest, most desperate dreams. Contact their commercial brokers immediately. I instructed, my fingers flying across the keyboard, to authorize a massive, irrevocable wire transfer from my primary holding account. Offer them 20% over their current market asking price. I want an expedited emergency closing finalized by tomorrow afternoon. Elias raised his eyebrows, a rare show of genuine surprise from my stoic attorney. You want to buy the entire hotel by tomorrow? I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city I had conquered while my family treated me like dirt. I did not just want to attend Uncle Calvin's little party. I wanted to control the very air he breathed while he gave his pompous speech. Make it happen, Elias, I said, locking my screen. I do not just want a seat at their table. I want to own the ground he is standing on when I tear his fake life apart. 24 hours later, the Atlanta skyline was painted in hues of deep violet and bruised orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The evening had arrived, and with it the culmination of 15 years of quiet, meticulous calculation. My black Maybach glided smoothly down Peachtree Street toward the historic Plaza Hotel. This was the premier venue for high society events in the city, a beacon of old money and exclusive prestige. It was exactly the kind of place Uncle Calvin used to validate his stolen status. What he did not know was that the massive, irrevocable wire transfer I authorized the previous afternoon had cleared just a few hours ago. The expedited emergency closing was finalized. I did not just have an invitation to his prestigious charity gala. I owned the entire building. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle and onto the red carpet that led up to the grand entrance. The flash of cameras from local society photographers illuminated the warm night air. I was wearing a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown. It draped perfectly, catching the light with every step I took. The dress was a physical manifestation of absolute authority, a piece of high-fashion couture that cost significantly more than the luxury sedan my brother-in-law was currently leasing. I paired it with minimal jewelry, just a simple pair of diamond drop earrings and the heavy weight of absolute certainty. I did not need to wear flashy brand logos to prove my worth. True power does not need to shout. It simply arrives. I walked up the wide marble steps and passed through the heavy gilded doors of the hotel lobby. The air inside smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted filet, and the unmistakable scent of desperate networking. The grand ballroom was located at the end of a long, plush hallway. I could hear the hum of low, steady murmur of the city elite mingling over champagne towers. This was Uncle Calvin's defining night. This was the $100,000 event where he planned to stand before the wealthiest investors in the state and officially crown Liam as the sole heir to the business he had ripped from my grieving mother's hands. I reached the arched entrance of the grand ballroom and paused, taking in the scene. The room was dripping in manufactured elegance. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over 50 circular tables covered in pristine white linen. But before I could even hand my coat to the coat check attendant, my path was deliberately blocked. Uncle Calvin stepped directly in front of me, flanked closely by Liam. Calvin was wearing a brand new tuxedo, tailored to hide his expanding waistline. A tuxedo I knew was purchased on a line of credit that my holding company now controlled. His face immediately twisted into a mask of smug, arrogant superiority. "I told you not to bother showing up tonight, Maya," Calvin said, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked me up and down, taking in the emerald gown with a scoff. "I guess Chloe was right. You really did lose your mind after getting yourself fired yesterday. Did you take out a payday loan just to rent that dress? You are embarrassing yourself. This room is for people who actually build things. It is not for bitter former assistants trying to play dress-up." I did not respond to his insult. Instead, my eyes drifted over to Liam. The contrast between my uncle's booming arrogance and my brother-in-law's physical state was almost comical. Liam looked absolutely dreadful. His skin was pale and clammy, coated in a thin sheen of nervous sweat. He was clutching a crystal glass of scotch so tightly his knuckles were white, and the ice cubes clinked visibly due to his trembling hand. He had spent the entire day watching his fraudulent real estate portfolio get systematically locked down by Vanguard Holdings. His bank accounts were frozen. His properties were facing immediate foreclosure. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. Yet thanks to Chloe's fragile ego and her desperate lies, Liam still did not fully understand the complete picture. Chloe had convinced them both that my signature and the corporate stamp were just the erratic actions of a rogue employee who had been promptly fired. Liam thought Vanguard Holdings was just some faceless corporate entity that coincidentally decided to crush him on the same day. I was terrified, but he was trying desperately to maintain his facade because he needed to secure bailout loans from the investors in this very room tonight. Calvin, completely oblivious to Liam's internal collapse, stepped closer to me. "You should turn around and walk right back out those doors, Maya. But since you insisted on crashing an event you could never afford, I am going to let you stay. I want you to sit down and watch what real success looks like. I want you to see Liam take his rightful place at the top of this family." Calvin snapped his thick fingers, signaling for the head maitre d' to approach. The elegant man in a crisp uniform hurried over, holding a leather seating chart. "Take my niece here and put her at table 42. Calvin ordered, waving a dismissive hand in my direction. "Put her right by the kitchen swinging doors. Make sure she stays out of the way of the important guests. Let her sit in the back with the staff and watch how real power operates." Liam shifted uncomfortably, swallowing hard. "Calvin, maybe we should just let her leave." Liam mumbled, his voice lacking its usual aggressive bite. "We have investors to talk to. We do not need any distractions tonight." "Nonsense," Calvin boomed, clapping a heavy hand on Liam's shoulder, causing the younger man to flinch. "She needs to learn her place. Someone has to be at the bottom, Liam. It is the natural order of things. She does not have the blood or the brains for the front of the room." I looked at Uncle Calvin and offered a slow, graceful smile. It was not a smile of submission. It was a smile of pure lethal anticipation. "Table 42 sounds absolutely perfect, Uncle," I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. "I would not want to miss a single moment of your grand presentation. Please do not let me keep you from your guests." Calvin sneered, clearly disappointed that I had not thrown a tantrum or burst into tears. He turned his back on me, dragging a sweating Liam toward the center of the ballroom to begin their desperate networking. I turned to the maitre d', who was still standing beside me, holding his seating chart. The maitre d' looked down at his list, and then slowly looked up at me. Earlier that afternoon, the hotel's general manager had held an emergency meeting with the senior hospitality staff to inform them of the sudden immediate change in ownership. The staff had been briefed. They had been given a name and a description of the woman who now signed their paychecks. The maitre d' met my gaze. His eyes widened slightly in a mix of sudden recognition and profound terror. He realized he had just been ordered by an arrogant guest to seat the absolute owner of the entire luxury hotel next to the kitchen garbage station. I gave him a very small, reassuring nod, indicating that I wanted him to play along. He swallowed hard, his posture instantly snapping into a rigid display of extreme deference. "Right this way, Miss Caldwell," the maitre d' whispered, his voice trembling with deep respect. "Please let me know if the temperature is comfortable or if you require absolutely anything at all from my staff." I followed him across the sprawling ballroom, navigating through the sea of designer suits and expensive perfumes. We passed the elite tables near the grand stage where the wealthiest developers in Atlanta were sipping champagne and discussing market trends. We kept walking until we reached the very back of the room. Table 42 was exactly as Calvin had described it. It was positioned in the shadows, shoved into a dark corner, directly next to the heavy metal swinging doors of the catering kitchen. It was the table reserved for last-minute obligations and unwanted guests. It was the ultimate social insult. The maitre d' pulled out my chair, wiping down the pristine white linen with a cloth napkin just to be safe. He poured me a glass of iced water with shaking hands and quickly retreated to the safety of the lobby. I sat down in the shadows, the sounds of clattering plates and shouting chefs filtering through the kitchen doors behind me. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I could see Uncle Calvin laughing loudly, slapping a prominent local politician on the back. I could see Chloe wearing a diamond necklace she could no longer afford, showing off to the wives of actual millionaires. And I could see Liam wiping sweat from his forehead, repeatedly checking his dead phone, waiting for a miracle that was never going to come. They thought they had buried me in the dark. They thought they had finally proven their absolute superiority by shoving me into the corner with the service staff. They were so busy looking down on me that they forgot to look at the ground beneath their feet. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my sleek black tablet. I placed it on the white linen tablecloth next to my water glass. The screen illuminated, casting a soft glow over my face. The financial acquisition files were loaded. The foreclosure documents were queued up and synchronized. The trap was fully primed. I settled back into my chair, crossing my legs gracefully in my emerald gown. I was sitting at the bottom of the room, just as Calvin had commanded, but I was the one holding all the strings. I sat perfectly still in the shadows of the grand ballroom. The heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen fluttered open and closed directly behind my chair. The sounds of clattering plates, hissing steam, and shouting chefs provided a harsh contrast to the refined string quartet playing at the very front of the room. From my isolated corner at table 42, I had a complete and unobstructed view of the entire charity gala. The room was a sea of expensive tailored tuxedos and glittering designer gowns. Everyone who considered themselves anyone in the Atlanta real estate market was in attendance tonight. And right in the middle of that glittering crowd was Liam. I was practically vibrating with desperate, frantic energy. He held a fresh glass of bourbon in his hand, gesturing wildly as he cornered a group of elite property developers near the center stage. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was begging. The financial grip I had placed on his shell companies that morning was suffocating him. He needed a massive injection of cash to save his fraudulent empire from the foreclosure notices I had scheduled to hit his phone later tonight. I watched him laugh too loudly at a joke one of the developers made. He was sweating straight through his tailored jacket. He looked exactly like a man treading water with a cinder block tied securely to his ankles. Chloe was standing near the towering champagne fountain, showing off a diamond necklace to the wives of the investors Liam was currently harassing. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her luxury lifestyle was evaporating by the second. She caught my eye from across the room and offered a smug, victorious little wave. She fully believed she had successfully banished me to the loser table. She thought she had won. I simply raised my glass of sparkling water to her in a silent toast. Let her enjoy her final hour of delusion. My attention shifted back to Liam. He had abandoned the first group of developers and was now zeroing in on his primary target for the evening. Richard Sterling. Richard was a legendary billionaire investor in the southern commercial sector. He was a man known for his ruthless business acumen and his endlessly deep pockets. Liam had been chasing him for months, desperate to secure a private bailout loan to keep his house of cards from collapsing. I watched Liam step directly into Richard Sterling's path. Liam extended his hand, his mouth moving rapidly as he launched into his heavily rehearsed elevator pitch. Richard Sterling did not even slow his pace. He barely glanced at Liam. He certainly did not shake his hand. He simply walked right past my brother-in-law mid-sentence. Liam was left standing in the middle of the crowded ballroom with his hand awkwardly extended, talking to absolutely empty air. Several high society guests noticed the blatant rejection and turned their heads to whisper among themselves. Liam's face flushed a deep, humiliating shade of red. He quickly pulled his hand back and took a large, desperate gulp of his bourbon, trying to pretend the rejection had not just happened. Richard Sterling continued his determined path through the ballroom. He bypassed the VIP tables at the very front where Uncle Calvin was holding court. He ignored the local politicians and the eager socialites trying desperately to catch his eye. He walked straight down the center aisle, moving further and further back into the room. He walked past the middle-tier tables. He walked past the busy open bar. He kept walking until he reached the dark, neglected corner by the kitchen doors. He stopped directly in front of table 42. The few service staff members lingering nearby froze in their tracks. A billionaire investor abandoning the prestigious front of the room to visit the outcast table was completely unheard of. Richard Sterling looked down at me and offered a warm, genuine smile. "Ms. Caldwell," Richard said, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute respect. He reached down, took my right hand, and gently kissed the back of it. "It is an extraordinary honor to stand in a building you own. I was thrilled when I heard the news of your emergency acquisition this afternoon. Vanguard Holdings continues to set the standard for the rest of us in this city." "Thank you, Richard," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly leveled. "It was a fast close, but the property has excellent bones. I appreciate you taking the time to come all the way back here to say hello. I would never pass up an opportunity to pay my respects to the sharpest mind in Atlanta real estate," Richard said. He offered a slight formal bow, entirely ignoring the chaotic noise of the kitchen staff arguing behind me. "We will have to discuss that downtown development project next week. Enjoy your evening, Ms. Caldwell." Richard turned around and walked casually back toward the elite section of the room. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the departing billionaire and looked toward the center of the brilliant ballroom. Liam was standing completely still. The flushed embarrassment from his recent public rejection had vanished entirely. It was replaced by an ashen, sickly gray pallor. He had witnessed the entire interaction from across the floor. He saw the legendary billionaire investor walk past him just to come kiss my hand. He saw the deep, undeniable respect in Richard Sterling's posture. I could see the exact moment the gears in his desperate mind finally locked into place. The strange signature on the eviction notice that morning, the embossed metal corporate stamp, the sudden catastrophic recall of his massive business loans, the terrified bow of the restaurant manager the night before, and now a billionaire publicly referring to me as the owner of the very building we were standing in. Liam stared at me across the crowded room, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered into a dozen pieces, the amber liquid splashing across his expensive leather shoes. He finally realized who I was. He finally realized that the pathetic sister-in-law he had mocked and humiliated for years was the apex predator waiting patiently in the dark. The sharp crash of Liam dropping his crystal bourbon glass was entirely swallowed by the sudden swell of applause near the front of the ballroom. While Liam stood frozen in a puddle of his own spilled liquor, his face the color of wet ash, Uncle Calvin was already on the move. Calvin did not even notice his golden son-in-law having a silent mental breakdown just 3 feet away. Calvin was too focused on the spotlight. He adjusted his silk lapels, puffed out his chest, and marched toward the grand stage erected at the center of the room. This was the exact moment he had been dreaming about for a decade. The moment he could cement his stolen legacy in front of the wealthiest and most influential people in Atlanta. I remained perfectly still in my chair at table 42, watching the spectacle unfold. I rested my hands lightly on either side of my sleek black tablet. The screen was currently dark, but it was awake, waiting for my final command. Calvin climbed the short flight of velvet stairs to the stage. He stepped up to the clear acrylic podium and grabbed the microphone with a heavy, confident hand. He tapped it twice. The dull thud echoed through the massive ballroom, signaling the elite crowd to settle down. The low hum of networking and clinking champagne glasses gradually faded into a respectful silence. Waiters stopped pouring wine. The string quartet lowered their bows. Every eye in the room turned toward my uncle. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Calvin began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. He sounded exactly like a man who believed his own lies. "We are gathered in this magnificent venue to celebrate a cause greater than ourselves, but we are also here to celebrate the future. Looking out at this room, I see the titans of our city. I see men and women who understand what it takes to build real generational wealth." I took a slow sip of my water. Generational wealth. It was a fascinating choice of words coming from a man who had manipulated a grieving widow to steal his brother's logistics company and then bankrupted it into the ground. But the high society crowd did not know that history. They offered polite, appreciative nods, buying into the charismatic facade he projected. "Building an empire is not for the weak," Calvin continued, gripping the edges of the podium. "It requires vision. It requires an iron will. And most importantly, it requires knowing how to protect the bloodline from leeches. There are always people who want to tear you down when you reach the top. There are always people who want to feed off your success without putting in a single day of hard work themselves. But in our family, we do not tolerate weakness. We reward ambition." Down on the main floor, Chloe was practically glowing. She stood near the front row wearing her incredibly expensive dress, beaming up at Calvin like he was a god. She clapped loudly at his words, throwing her shoulders back so the surrounding wives of actual billionaires could see just how important she was. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was standing a few yards away, looking like he was about to go into cardiac arrest. "Speaking of ambition," Calvin said, sweeping his heavy gaze across the front tables, "I want to take a special moment tonight to recognize the future of my family empire. He is a man who understands the value of a dollar and the power of a relentless work ethic. He is a visionary in the commercial real estate sector, and he is the man I am proud to call my son-in-law. Liam, please step forward." The spotlight swung away from the podium and illuminated the spot where Liam was standing. The sudden bright light hit him like a physical blow. He flinched violently, raising a shaking hand to shield his eyes. He was sweating profusely. His breathing was rapid and shallow. He looked absolutely nothing like the powerful mogul Calvin was describing. He looked like a cornered animal waiting for the slaughter. Chloe turned around, searching for him in the crowd. When she spotted him in the spotlight, she blew a dramatic, exaggerated kiss in his direction. "Come on up here, Liam," Calvin boomed, gesturing toward the stage. "Let them see the man who is going to take over the throne. Let them see the sole successor of the family business." Liam did not move toward the stage. He could not. His feet were rooted to the marble floor. He looked frantically from Uncle Calvin on the stage to me sitting in the dark shadows at the very back of the room. He raised his hands, shaking his head side to side in a desperate, panicked motion. He mouthed the word "stop." He waved his arms, trying to quietly signal Calvin to cut the speech short. Liam knew exactly what was about to happen. I knew that invoking his real estate business in front of the woman who currently held the foreclosure papers was pure suicide. But Calvin completely misunderstood the gesture. Calvin laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled the ballroom. "Look at him," Calvin told the crowd, pointing at Liam. "He is too humble for his own good. He does not want the spotlight, but he deserves it. He is a true titan." The crowd offered a generous round of applause. Liam closed his eyes tightly, swaying slightly on his feet. He looked like he was going to vomit right there on the polished floor. Calvin soaked in the applause, raising his hands to quiet the room once more. He leaned closer to the microphone, his expression shifting from jovial arrogance to something far more mean-spirited and vindictive. He could not resist. He had the largest audience of his life, and he wanted to use it to deliver his ultimate finishing blow against me. "You know," Calvin said, his voice dripping with condescension, "not everyone in our bloodline has what it takes to succeed. It is a sad reality, but it is the truth. Some family members lack the ambition to sit at the front. They choose to be bitter. They choose to be resentful. They choose to sit in the dark and watch while the real builders change the world." Calvin raised his hand and pointed a thick finger directly over the heads of the crowd. He pointed straight to the back of the room, straight past the elite tables, straight toward the kitchen doors. He pointed exactly at table 42. "They belong at the bottom," Calvin declared, his voice ringing out with absolute cruel finality. "Let them stay at the bottom. Liam, my son, you belong at the top." A heavy, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the ballroom. The elite guests turned in their seats, craning their necks to look toward the back of the room to see who the patriarch was publicly shaming. They expected to see a cowering, defeated relative trying to hide from the humiliation. Instead, they saw me. I was sitting perfectly straight, my emerald silk gown catching the ambient light, my expression utterly serene and untouched by his venom. I did not break eye contact with Calvin. I let him hold his pointing finger in the air for a long, suspended moment. I let him savor the absolute peak of his delusional power. Liam was now openly weeping near the front of the room. Tears of pure terror streamed down his pale face. He knew the ledge had just crumbled beneath them. I looked down at the sleek black tablet resting on the white linen tablecloth in front of me. The screen was illuminated, displaying the master control dashboard for my financial acquisitions and the hotel integrated management systems. The trap was loaded, the audience was perfectly attentive, the prey was standing exactly where I wanted him. I reached out with a single steady finger. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the family that had spent 15 years trying to bury me alive. I tapped a single button on my tablet, Execute Order 35. The immediate aftermath of my finger lifting from the illuminated screen of the tablet was absolute calculated chaos. A high-pitched, ear-splitting screech of audio feedback ripped through the state-of-the-art sound system. The agonizing noise sliced through the elegant ballroom, causing dozens of high society investors and wealthy developers to physically flinch and cover their ears. Up on the grand stage, Uncle Calvin jumped backward in surprise, ripping the microphone away from his mouth with a startled, heavy curse. Before the painful echo of the feedback could completely fade from the room, the lighting shifted. The thousands of crystals in the massive chandeliers suspended above the crowd dimmed rapidly, plunging the edges of the extravagant space into deep, heavy shadows. Only a few strategic spotlights remained active, casting long, dramatic beams across the polished marble floor. Then came the sound that truly shifted the atmosphere in the room, from a moment of technical difficulty to a creeping sense of being trapped. A heavy, synchronized mechanical click echoed loudly from the perimeter of the ballroom. The massive, solid oak double doors at the front entrance, the side exits, and the terrace access points all simultaneously locked their deadbolts. I had just sealed the room. No one was leaving until I was entirely finished. Up on the stage, Uncle Calvin was completely disoriented. He tapped the metal grill of the microphone with his thick fingers. He blew into it. He barked a test phrase, but the device was completely dead. The booming, arrogant voice he had relied on for 15 years to bully and command the people around him was suddenly reduced to a pathetic, unamplified shout in a cavernous room. He glared toward the audio-visual booth set up in the balcony, waving his arms and demanding that someone fix the equipment immediately. He was so accustomed to snapping his fingers and having the world bend to his will that he could not comprehend what was actually happening. From the side wings of the stage, the general manager of the Plaza Hotel emerged. He walked with a brisk, purposeful stride, his posture perfectly straight, and his hands clasped neatly in front of him. Calvin spotted him and immediately began barking orders, jabbing his finger at the dead microphone and demanding that the manager restore the power so he could finish his keynote speech. The general manager did not apologize to my uncle. He did not bow, he did not flinch, and he did not offer a single word of deference. He stepped up onto the platform, walked right past Calvin's imposing frame, and grabbed the heavy metal microphone stand. With a sharp, deliberate tug, the manager physically unplugged the thick audio cable from the base. He picked up the entire setup, carried it to the far back corner of the stage, and set it down in the shadows. He completely stripped Calvin of his platform, leaving the arrogant patriarch standing awkwardly in the center of the stage, totally voiceless and empty-handed. A wave of confused, nervous whispers washed over the elite crowd. Investors exchanged bewildered glances, unsure if this was part of the planned entertainment or a genuine emergency. The general manager descended the velvet-lined stairs of the stage. He did not look at the confused guests. He walked directly down the wide center aisle of the ballroom, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He walked straight past the front row, VIP tables, past a hyperventilating Liam, and headed directly toward the dark, neglected corner by the kitchen doors. He headed directly toward me. I stood up slowly from table 42. I smoothed the front of my custom-tailored emerald green silk gown, ensuring the fabric draped perfectly. I stepped out of the shadows and into the center aisle. As I moved, the primary spotlight that had previously blinded Liam up at the front of the room pivoted sharply. The bright, crisp beam of light tracked my movement, illuminating me perfectly against the dimmed background of the ballroom. The general manager met me halfway down the center aisle. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a brand new, pristine, gold-plated wireless microphone. He held it out to me with both hands, offering it with the profound, undeniable reverence of a man serving his absolute superior. I took the gold microphone. It felt heavy and substantial in my grip, like a weapon forged specifically for this exact second in time. I began my walk down the center aisle. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels echo through the quieted room. The wealthiest commercial real estate developers, politicians, and investors in Atlanta turned and stared at me. As I moved forward, the densely packed crowd instinctively parted. They stepped back from the aisle, pulling their silk dresses and tailored jackets out of my path, parting like the Red Sea dividing for a conqueror. They did not know exactly who I was yet, but they could feel the absolute terrifying shift in the room's power dynamic radiating outward from my every step. Near the front row, Liam was pressing himself backward against a white linen table, clutching his chest and taking rapid, shallow breaths. He looked as though the floor had just opened up beneath him. Chloe, however, was still trapped entirely within her delusion. Her face was twisted in furious, uncomprehending disbelief. She saw me walking down the aisle in a dress she knew she could never afford, holding the attention of the entire room, and her fragile ego simply shattered. Chloe let out an angry shriek and lunged forward, trying to step directly into my path to stop me. But before she could even cross the boundary of the aisle, two towering men in dark suits materialized from the crowd. They were my private security detail, having slipped quietly through the kitchen doors right behind me. They flanked my sister, instantly grabbing her by the arms and forcing her roughly back into the crowd without speaking a single word. Chloe struggled and gasped in pure shock, but they held her firmly in place, forcing her to watch. I stopped at the very base of the stage. I looked up at Uncle Calvin. He was standing right at the edge of the platform, looking down at me. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The veins in his thick neck were bulging against his tight collar. His grand moment of triumph, the night he was supposed to cement his stolen legacy forever, had been completely hijacked by the niece he had spent 15 years trying to destroy. Calvin pointed a shaking, thick finger down at me. Then he turned his furious, bulging eyes toward the general manager, who was standing respectfully a few feet behind my right shoulder. "What is the meaning of this?" Calvin screamed, his voice cracking with exertion as he tried desperately to project his unamplified words across the massive, silent ballroom. "I told you to keep her in the back. I am hosting a $100,000 charity gala in this room. Call your security team right now. I demand that you throw this woman out of the building immediately." The general manager did not blink. He did not shift his weight or show a single ounce of intimidation. He looked up at Uncle Calvin, his expression entirely devoid of the subservient, eager fear Calvin was so used to commanding from the people he paid. The manager's voice was calm, exceptionally clear, and carried perfectly through the tense, absolute silence of the grand ballroom. "I do not take orders from guests, sir," the general manager stated evenly, letting the devastating reality of his words hang in the air. "I take orders from the property owner." The general manager's words hung in the stale air of the ballroom, heavy and absolute. For a long, suspended moment, nobody in the massive room dared to breathe. Up on the darkened stage, Uncle Calvin stood frozen like a poorly carved statue. His mouth opened and closed in a grotesque display of silent fury, but no sound came out. He looked wildly from the general manager to the stunned crowd, and then slowly his bulging eyes locked onto me. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand aisle. The gold microphone rested comfortably in my hand while I remained bathed in the sharp, solitary beam of the tracking spotlight. The surrounding society elites, the billionaire investors, and the ruthless property developers were all watching me with a sudden electrifying realization. They were witnessing a hostile corporate takeover in real time. Calvin gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, his thick knuckles turning completely white under the strain. He tried to project his voice without the amplification, his tone raw, grating, and desperate. "This is a trick," Calvin bellowed, pointing his heavy finger down at me once again. "Do not listen to a word she says. She is a broke assistant. She rents a cheap apartment on the edge of town. You are making a massive mistake listening to her. I demand you throw her out right now." I did not flinch at his shouting. I simply raised the gold microphone to my lips. When I spoke, my voice echoed through the high ceilings of the ballroom, crystal clear, completely unbothered and surgically cold. "Uncle Calvin, you are right," I said, letting the calm devastation of my words wash over the silent crowd. "Someone does have to be at the bottom. But you severely miscalculated who was holding the ladder." I did not wait for his limited mind to process the insult. I turned my gaze upward toward the darkened balcony at the rear of the ballroom. I offered a single crisp nod to the audio-visual technicians manning the control boards. These technicians were no longer taking orders from the event planners. They were operating on my direct payroll. Instantly, the massive high-definition projector screens flanking the grand stage flickered to life. All evening, those screens had proudly displayed Uncle Calvin's fabricated family crest and the gaudy gold logo of Liam's fake real estate firm. In a fraction of a second, those arrogant images vanished completely. The massive screens flooded the darkened stage with a stark, bright white light. They displayed crisp, high-resolution images of highly classified banking documents, acquisition records, and certified legal deeds. A collective audible gasp rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests seated at the tables. These people were seasoned business sharks. They spent their lives looking at contracts, and they immediately recognized the strict, undeniable formatting of federal foreclosure notices and commercial property deeds. "Look behind you, Uncle," I instructed, my voice ringing out with effortless, absolute authority. Calvin slowly turned his bulky frame around, his movements rigid with a sudden creeping dread. He tilted his head back to look at the massive screen positioned directly behind him. Displayed in towering high definition was a certified commercial property deed. It was the absolute, undeniable deed to the historic Plaza Hotel, the very building we were all currently standing inside. The document was dated from that exact afternoon, highlighted in bright fluorescent yellow ink. Right at the bottom of the page was the name of the new sole proprietor, Maya Caldwell, Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Holdings. The silence in the room fractured. The ballroom erupted into shocked, excited chatter. High society allegiances shift at the speed of light when real, undeniable money enters the room. I looked out at the sea of investors and socialites. They were frantically whispering to each other, pointing at the screens and looking back at me with a profound, terrifying level of respect. I saw the billionaire Richard Sterling standing near the front row, offering me a slow, appreciative nod. I smiled warmly at the audience, allowing my posture to relax into that of a gracious host. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced smoothly, my voice cutting through their whispers, "I sincerely apologize for the dramatic interruption to your evening. However, as the new landlord of this fine establishment, I would like to personally welcome you to my property. Please continue to enjoy yourselves. All drinks at the bar are now entirely on the house, courtesy of Vanguard Holdings." A few men in the front row actually raised their crystal champagne glasses toward me in a salute of deep, undeniable respect. Real wealth is not just about taking things away from your enemies. It is about effortlessly providing for a room full of powerful people while simultaneously crushing the man on the stage. Up on the platform, Calvin staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickeningly gray. He stared at my name projected 20 feet high behind his head. He shook his head frantically, muttering to himself that it was impossible, that it was a forged document, that I could not possibly possess that kind of liquid capital. He was watching his 15-year illusion of supremacy evaporate right in front of his eyes. His fake empire was burning to the ground, and I was the one holding the match. Over on the sidelines, I could see Chloe still being firmly restrained by my private security detail. Her designer makeup was smeared from crying tears of pure, unadulterated frustration. She stared at the hotel deed on the screen, her brain completely failing to compute the math. The sister she had mocked for renting a cheap apartment had just casually purchased a historic luxury hotel purely to ruin their evening. Her mouth hung open, but she had absolutely no insults left to scream. But I was not finished. Calvin and Chloe were just the loud, obnoxious distractions. The real parasite, the man who had built a fake life using my family as a shield, was hiding down on the main floor. I slowly turned my body away from the stage and locked my eyes onto Liam. My white brother-in-law was leaning heavily against a front-row VIP table, clutching his chest with a trembling hand. He looked like he was suffering a severe medical emergency. The elite real estate developers he had been desperately schmoozing just minutes ago had all taken a distinct physical step away from him. They looked from the financial documents on the screens to Liam, realizing instantly that the man who had been begging them for a bailout loan was a complete fraud. Liam was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically around the locked room, looking for an exit that did not exist. He knew exactly what was coming next. I raised the gold microphone again, my gaze pinning Liam to the polished marble floor like a specimen trapped on a glass slide. "Let us talk about the future of the family business," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. "Let us talk about the man you all came here to celebrate tonight." I gave another sharp, deliberate nod to the balcony. The massive screens behind the stage flashed and shifted instantly. The crisp white hotel deed vanished from the display. In its place appeared a massive, glaringly red document that cast a harsh crimson glow over Uncle Calvin's terrified face. The document on the screen was not just a simple late notice. It was a comprehensive, devastating forensic breakdown of his entire fraudulent portfolio. It displayed his empty shell companies, his wildly inflated asset valuations, and the extremely toxic high-interest loans he had used to fund his luxury lifestyle. The elite crowd of investors began pointing at the specific numbers on the screen, whispering sharply to one another, as they quickly realized the depth of his deception. Liam had been parading around their country clubs and charity galas, pretending to be a self-made mogul while secretly drowning in liabilities. The red default notice proved that he did not own a single brick of real estate in the city. He owned nothing but empty promises and staggering obligations. Blown up to 10 feet tall, displayed for every elite investor and developer in Atlanta to scrutinize, was Liam's unmistakable signature. It was positioned directly beneath a massive, overwhelming mountain of delinquent predatory debt owed exclusively to Vanguard Holdings. The glaring red light from the massive projector screens bathed Liam in a harsh and unforgiving glow. I held the gold microphone perfectly steady and directed my attention to the very men Liam had been desperately begging for a bailout just an hour ago. Let me translate this financial summary for those of you in the room who prefer plain English, I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the rising, anxious murmur of the ballroom. What you are looking at right now is the absolute anatomy of a fraud. I took a slow and deliberate step down the center aisle, closing the physical distance between myself and the man who had mocked my supposed poverty. Liam stood frozen against the VIP table, his chest heaving as he stared at his own signature magnified to 10 feet tall. Liam's property management firm does not own a single commercial lease in this city, I stated, ensuring my words reached every corner of the silent, captivated room. Every building he claims to manage, every asset he uses to inflate his supposed net worth, is held together by incredibly toxic, high-interest mezzanine debt. It is a house of cards funded by predatory lenders, and it is a debt that he officially defaulted on 72 hours ago. He has zero liquid capital. Hun has zero operating revenue. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the devastating reality sink into the minds of the wealthy investors standing around him. The men who had been considering doing business with him earlier in the evening were now looking at him with expressions of profound disgust. In their world, Losing money was a simple miscalculation, but lying about your capital to secure fraudulent partnerships was an unforgivable sin. But the tragedy of his incompetence gets much worse. I continued, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers above. You see, Liam entirely lacked the personal collateral required to secure these massive loans on his own. The banks knew he was a liability. So to secretly fund his spectacular failures in offshore cryptocurrency markets and his high-stakes sports gambling addiction, he needed a guarantor. He needed a naive, arrogant backer who trusted him implicitly and who would sign binding financial documents without bothering to read the fine print. I raised my hand and signaled the audio-visual booth in the balcony one more time. The massive screen shifted instantly, replacing the default notice with a secondary, highly detailed legal document. It was a collateral agreement, fully notarized, officially stamped, and undeniably binding. Liam's massive commercial real estate deal, the very same deal you were all invited here to celebrate tonight, was nothing more than a desperate predatory cash grab, I announced. And the collateral he used to blindly secure that cash grab was the primary residential estate of his own father-in-law. I pointed my free hand directly at Uncle Calvin, who was still standing up on the darkened stage. Calvin's thick knees buckled visibly under his own weight. He staggered forward a single step and stared up at the massive screen, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror as his brain finally registered the specific address listed on the collateral agreement. It was his house. It was the sprawling, multi-million-dollar suburban fortress he had purchased using the money he stole from my grieving mother 15 years ago. Liam forged the internal appraisals, bypassed the standard underwriting procedures through corrupt brokers, and fully leveraged your home to cover his gambling debts. Calvin, I said, delivering the fatal crushing blow without a single ounce of mercy. And because Liam defaulted on that loan, Vanguard Holdings seized the asset this morning. I now hold the absolute deed to your house. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. I slowly turned my attention away from the ruined patriarch on the stage and looked over at Chloe. My younger sister was standing near the front row of tables, her hands trembling as she clutched the heavy diamond necklace around her throat. The smug, triumphant expression she had worn like a crown her entire life was completely obliterated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked wildly from the screen displaying her uncle's ruined estate to the sweating, hyperventilating man she had married. I watched the exact moment her heavily constructed delusion shattered into a million jagged pieces. She finally understood the true magnitude of his deception. Liam was not a billionaire. He was not a powerful real estate mogul who was going to elevate her into the highest echelons of Atlanta society. He was a broke, desperate con artist who had just single-handedly bankrupted the man who had always protected her. The luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the lavish vacations were all funded by stolen money and fraudulent credit lines that I now exclusively controlled. Liam, Chloe whispered, her voice cracking in the quiet, tense room, her eyes filled with hot, panicked tears. Tell me she is lying, Liam. Tell me you did not put Uncle Calvin's house up for collateral. Tell me we are not broke. Liam could not speak. He was gasping for air, his face completely devoid of any remaining color. He looked away from his weeping wife and stared at the polished marble floor. The elite developers he had been trying to schmooze physically turned their backs on him. He was completely and permanently blacklisted. His entire identity, his perceived racial and economic superiority, and his fake wealth had been stripped away and burned to ashes in front of the most powerful people in the state. I was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own profound humiliation. The sheer overwhelming pressure of his absolute inescapable ruin finally snapped the last remaining fragile thread of his sanity. Liam let out a guttural, furious scream. It was not a word or a plea for mercy. It was just a raw, animalistic sound of pure, cornered rage. He pushed violently off the VIP table, knocking over a crystal champagne bucket that shattered loudly against the floor. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, fixed entirely and violently on me. He lunged forward, throwing his entire body toward the center aisle. He was aiming to physically tackle me to the ground, to rip the gold microphone from my hand, and to somehow violently silence the devastating truth that was destroying his life. He closed the short distance between us with terrifying, reckless speed, his hands reaching out aggressively to grab my throat. Several guests in the front row screamed in sudden panic, stumbling backward to get out of his destructive path. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward to protect myself. I simply stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, watching the pathetic fraud charge blindly toward his final devastating mistake. Before Liam could even come within 3 feet of me, the heavy shadows surrounding the main aisle suddenly shifted and exploded into motion. Elias and 2 massive men from my private security detail materialized as if they had been carved directly out of the darkness. They moved with terrifying, highly coordinated precision. One of the heavily muscled security guards stepped smoothly in front of me, perfectly, intercepting Liam's desperate charge. The guard drove a heavy, unyielding shoulder directly into Liam's chest. The sheer force of the defensive impact halted Liam's momentum instantly and lifted him completely off his feet. Liam flew backward through the air, his arms flailing wildly. He hit the polished marble floor of the ballroom face first. The sickening heavy crack of his jaw striking the hard stone echoed sharply through the grand room, accompanied immediately by the collective gasp of the horrified elite guests. The guard swiftly dropped down, driving a knee firmly into the center of Liam's back, pinning the ruined, thrashing fraud securely to the ground, while Elias calmly adjusted his suit jacket and stood perfectly by my side. I did not spare a single glance downward as I stepped directly over Liam's thrashing body. He was groaning in pain, his face pressed hard against the cold marble floor by my security team, his expensive suit rumpled and ruined. He was no longer a threat. He was just a pathetic, broken man facing the reality of his own catastrophic failures. The grand ballroom, previously buzzing with the networking of Atlanta's most powerful elite, was now dead silent. The only sounds were Liam's muffled whimpers and the sharp, deliberate click of my heels as I walked toward the stage. I approached the velvet-lined stairs with measured, unhurried steps. Every eye in the room was locked on me. The wealthy investors, the socialites, and the property developers watched with held breath as I ascended the platform. I walked straight up to Uncle Calvin. Calvin was no longer the booming, arrogant patriarch who had tried to humiliate me at my birthday dinner. He looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. His thick shoulders were slumped. Sweat beaded heavily on his forehead, reflecting the harsh light of the massive projector screens. He took a clumsy, stumbling step backward as I approached, but there was nowhere for him to run. He was trapped on the stage he had built for his own crowning moment. I stopped just 3 feet away from him. I did not raise the gold microphone to my mouth right away. I wanted to look him dead in the eye and watch the last remnants of his false superiority crumble. For 15 years he had loomed me, casting a dark, suffocating shadow over my life. He had stolen my father's business, manipulated my family, and made it his personal mission to ensure I felt worthless. Now, staring into his wide, terrified eyes, I saw nothing but a hollow, desperate old man. I raised my left hand and gave one final subtle signal to the audio-visual technicians operating in the balcony. The massive digital screens behind us shifted one last time. The glaring red default notice bearing Liam's signature vanished. In its place, a series of stark black and white legal documents appeared. They were incredibly detailed, bearing the official seals of the Federal Bankruptcy Court. Highlighted in bright yellow across the top of the towering screens was the name of the filing entity. It was Calvin's supposedly thriving logistics company. The date stamped clearly next to the federal seal was from exactly 8 years ago. A fresh wave of shocked whispers washed over the ballroom. The elite guests squinted at the screens, reading the itemized lists of liquidated assets, massive liabilities, and unpaid creditors. The men who had clapped for Calvin just 10 minutes ago now stared at him with profound, icy disdain. They realized that the patriarch lecturing them about generational wealth was an even bigger fraud than his son-in-law. I lifted the gold microphone. My voice was calm, steady, and stripped of any emotion. I spoke with cold, surgical precision. "You did not build an empire," Calvin announced, letting my words echo through the cavernous room. "You destroyed my father's legacy." Calvin opened his mouth to speak to deny the undeniable proof glowing behind his head, but his voice failed him. He just stared at me, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket. My father built a highly profitable, respected logistics firm with his own two hands. I continued making sure the entire ballroom heard the truth that had been buried for over a decade. When he passed away unexpectedly, you preyed on a grieving widow. You swooped in with shady lawyers, exploited legal loopholes, and seized control of a company you did not earn. And then, because you completely lack the intellect and the discipline required to run a real business, you drove his life's work straight into the ground. You liquidated the most valuable assets to buy your country club memberships and your luxury cars, and you left the company to drown in debt. I took a single step closer to him. He was physically trembling now. 8 years ago, you quietly filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy, to hide your massive failures from the city. I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre. You thought you buried your secrets perfectly, but you severely underestimated the daughter of the man you robbed. 3 years ago, when your remaining creditors were preparing to seize everything you had left and send you to federal prison for financial misconduct, I stepped in. I bought your debt through Vanguard Holdings out of pure pity for my family name. Calvin shook his head frantically side to side. His eyes were wide with a mix of denial and absolute horror. He was finally understanding the magnitude of the trap he had been living inside. I have secretly owned you for 3 years, Calvin. I declared the absolute truth, ringing out like a death knell. I have been paying the mortgage on the sprawling suburban house you sleep in. I hold the lease on the luxury car you drove here tonight. I own the credit line that bought the very custom suit you are currently wearing. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the crushing reality of his situation to fully saturate his mind. Last night at my 35th birthday dinner, you threw a $4,000 bill in my lap and told me to pay my share, I said, my tone laced with dark, devastating amusement. You mocked me for renting a cheap apartment. You told me I would always be at the bottom. You had absolutely no idea that you were sitting across from your own landlord. You have been living off my charity for years, Calvin. Every bite of food you eat, every breath of air you take in that massive house is entirely funded by the niece you tried to destroy. And as of this morning, that charity has been permanently revoked. The impact of my words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute crushing weight of his reality finally broke through his thick skull. He was not a king. He was not a self-made titan of industry. He was a deeply indebted puppet, and I had been holding his strings the entire time. Calvin let out a sharp, ragged gasp for air. His face turned a dangerous, sickly shade of gray. He reached up with a trembling hand and clutched tightly at the fabric over his chest. His breathing became erratic, a series of short, desperate wheezes, as panic completely overtook his nervous system. His thick knees visibly buckled. He could no longer support his own weight. Calvin collapsed forward, hitting the hard-polished stage floor with a heavy, resounding thud. He fell directly to his knees right in front of me. He was completely stripped of his fake wealth. He was stripped of his arrogant pride. He was stripped of his fabricated legacy in front of the entire elite society of the city he had tried to conquer. "Down on the main floor!" Chloe was screaming hysterically, still pinned back by my security guards. She watched her untouchable uncle fall to his knees, utterly broken and humiliated. The investors and developers who had packed the room simply watched in silence. No one rushed forward to help him. No one offered a hand to the fallen patriarch. In the world of high finance and elite society, there is no sympathy for a thief who gets caught. I stood over my uncle, looking down at his trembling, defeated form. I did not offer him a hand. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply looked at the man who had tormented me my entire life and watched him realize that he had lost absolutely everything. The empire was mine, the legacy was restored, and justice had finally been served. Exactly 1 week passed since the heavy oak doors of the Plaza Hotel ballroom unlocked and the elite society of Atlanta watched my uncle collapse on the stage. The resulting fallout in the city was absolute and merciless. High society is an ecosystem built entirely on the perception of wealth, and the moment the city realized Uncle Calvin and Liam were completely bankrupt, the social execution was swift and brutal. Wealthy investors immediately pulled their backing. Exclusive country club memberships were permanently revoked. The local business journals ran front-page stories detailing the spectacular collapse of their fraudulent real estate empire. The dust had finally settled, and I was back in my sanctuary. I sat in my high-backed leather chair behind the massive mahogany desk in my penthouse office at Vanguard Tower. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, bright streams of light across the polished wood. The city outside was moving at its usual frantic pace, but inside my office the air was perfectly calm. Elias, my chief corporate attorney, stood quietly by the window, reviewing a digital tablet with his usual sharp focus. We had spent the last 7 days legally dismantling every remaining asset tied to my uncle and my brother-in-law. There was absolutely nothing left to seize. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open. 2 of my private security guards stepped inside, flanking the 2 people who had desperately requested an emergency meeting. Uncle Calvin and Chloe walked slowly into the room. The physical transformation they had undergone in just 7 days was staggering. Calvin looked as though he had aged 10 full years. His previously broad, intimidating shoulders were completely slumped. He was not wearing a bespoke suit tailored to hide his flaws. He was wearing a plain, wrinkled dress shirt and cheap slacks that hung loosely on his frame. The arrogant, booming aura that used to precede him was entirely gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating cloud of total defeat. His face was gray, and his eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights. Chloe walked beside him, looking like a fragile, broken shell of the woman who had clinked her champagne glass at my birthday dinner. She was not wearing designer silk or heavy diamond necklaces. She wore a simple faded sweater and plain jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and her face was puffy and raw from crying. She looked around the multi-million-dollar penthouse suite, but there was no entitlement or arrogance in her eyes this time. There was only absolute terror. I did not offer them a seat. I did not offer them coffee or a polite greeting. I simply rested my hands on my desk and watched them stand awkwardly in the center of the room. Noticeably absent from this little family reunion was Liam, the golden boy, the fake real estate mogul who had told me to apply for a minimum wage receptionist job, was nowhere to be found. In the early hours following the charity gala, when federal authorities began looking into the forged appraisals and predatory loans Liam had used to secure his cash, he made his final cowardly choice. He packed a single duffel bag, drained whatever loose cash he could find from Chloe's personal purse, and fled the state. He abandoned his wife the moment the illusion shattered, leaving her to face the devastating consequences of his fraud entirely alone. Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick neck. He took a hesitant, shuffling step toward my desk, wringing his hands together like a reprimanded child facing a judge. Maya Calvin began, his voice hoarse and stripped of all its former power. "Thank you for agreeing to see us. We know how busy you are." I kept my expression perfectly neutral. "Why are you here, Calvin?" I asked, my voice smooth and surgical. "The foreclosure on your estate is finalized. The locks on your house have already been changed. Your accounts are frozen. There is absolutely nothing left for us to discuss." Chloe let out a loud, ragged sob and buried her face in her hands. She was trembling violently, unable to even look me in the eye. "Please, Maya," Calvin pleaded, taking another step forward. "We are begging you. You cannot do this. You cannot put your own family out on the street. We have absolutely nowhere to go." Liam took everything Chloe had left before he ran. "She has nothing. I have nothing. My credit is destroyed. My reputation is completely gone. We are ruined." I watched him beg. This was the man who had stolen my father's legacy, who had spent a decade parading around the city, pretending to be a self-made king, while feeding off the scraps of my family. This was the man who had laughed out loud when a $4,000 bill was thrown directly into my lap. "We are blood, Maya," Calvin continued, his voice cracking with desperate emotion. "Your father was my brother. He would not want this. He would not want to see his family torn apart and thrown into the gutter. We made mistakes. We admit that. We were wrong. We did not know you were the boss. We did not know you owned Vanguard Holdings. If we had known who you really were, we never would have treated you that way." The sheer audacity of his statement hung in the quiet air of the penthouse. He was not apologizing for his cruelty. He was not apologizing for years of emotional abuse, for stealing my college fund, or for treating me like a pathetic loser. I was only apologizing because he had unknowingly abused the woman who held the deed to his entire life. He was sorry he got caught. He was sorry he picked the wrong victim. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool surface of the mahogany desk. I looked directly into his bloodshot, pleading eyes. "That is exactly the problem, Calvin," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous timbre. "You think your only mistake was treating a billionaire poorly. You think the tragedy here is that you did not realize I had money. It never even occurred to you to just be a decent human being to your brother's daughter, regardless of what was in her bank account. You only respect power, and you only respect wealth. Well, I have both. And I am telling you right now that your blood means absolutely nothing to me." Chloe lifted her tear-stained face, looking at me with pure desperation. "Maya, please," she wept, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I do not have a place to sleep tonight. Liam left me with a mountain of legal fees. I do not know how to survive out there. I am your sister. You have to help me. I will do anything. I will work for you. I will clean this office. Just please do not leave me with nothing." I looked at my younger sister. I remembered the smug, victorious smile she wore when she thought she had successfully gotten me fired from my own company. I remembered the countless times she had joined Calvin in tearing me down, eagerly participating in my humiliation just to secure her spot as the golden child. She had built her entire identity on my supposed failure. I reached out and opened the top drawer of my desk. The room was dead silent except for Chloe's ragged breathing. I pulled out 2 thick manila folders and placed them carefully on the polished wood surface. I slid the folders slowly across the expansive mahogany desk until they stopped right at the edge directly in front of Calvin and Chloe. I looked at their tear-stained, terrified faces and prepared to deliver the absolute and final verdict on their miserable lives. "Those folders contain the exact sum of your worth to me," I said, my voice steady and surgically cold. "Open them." Calvin reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the heavy cover of the first file. He stared at the crisp legal documents inside his bloodshot eyes, scanning the bold black text. I watched his thick shoulders slump even further as he read the title of the first page. It was a formal, immediate notice of termination. He was officially fired from the logistics company he had stolen from my father 15 years ago. I was removing him from the board, stripping him of his inflated salary, and seizing the company cars he used to parade around the city. Right behind his termination papers was the official 30-day notice to vacate his sprawling suburban estate. The house was already legally in my name. He had exactly 1 month to pack whatever personal belongings he had left and get off my property. Chloe frantically opened the second folder. She gasped, a fresh wave of tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked at her own eviction notice. Liam's luxury condominium, the one they had used to host their pretentious dinner parties, was heavily leveraged and completely defaulted. The bank had handed the deed directly to Vanguard Holdings. "You cannot do this to me," Chloe whispered, looking up from the documents with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "I am your little sister. We grew up together. I have absolutely no money in my personal accounts. Liam maxed out my credit cards before he ran away. How am I supposed to pay for a place to live?" I looked at her without a single ounce of pity. I leaned back in my high-backed leather chair and folded my hands neatly on my lap. "I believe your husband offered some excellent financial advice just last week, at my birthday dinner," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "If you are short on cash, I hear minimum wage receptionists can eventually afford rent if they budget right. I suggest you start looking for employment immediately. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Chloe let out a devastated, high-pitched sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute reality of her ruined life crashed down upon her. She had spent her entire existence mocking my ambition, choosing to rely on the fake prestige of an arrogant, fraudulent man. Now the man was gone, the prestige was evaporated, and she was left facing the cold, hard consequences of her own horrific choices. Calvin slammed his hand flat against my desk, trying to summon one last shred of his former patriarchal authority. He glared at me, his face twisted in a mixture of desperate anger and profound humiliation. "You are a monster!" Maya. Calvin spat, his voice trembling with weak, ineffective rage. Your father would be absolutely disgusted if he could see what you are doing to his family right now. You are throwing your own blood out onto the street just to satisfy a bitter, petty vendetta. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the pathetic, broken man sitting across from me and dismantled his final, desperate illusion. Do not ever invoke my father's name in this office. I commanded, my voice carrying the lethal, freezing weight of absolute authority. My father was a builder. You are a parasite. You did not come here today because you were sorry for the 15 years of emotional abuse you put me through. You did not come here to apologize for stealing my college fund, for mocking my career, or for trying to humiliate me in front of your wealthy friends. You are not sorry you abused me, Calvin. You are just sorry you were abusing your landlord. He opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely nothing left to say. His lies were useless. His manipulation had no power in this room. I was a fraud who had finally been dragged into the light, and he knew there was no escaping the final judgment. We are completely finished here, I announced. I reached out and pressed the silver button on my desk intercom. Instantly, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open. 4 members of my private security detail stepped into the room. They moved with quiet professional efficiency, stepping directly behind the chairs where Calvin and Chloe were sitting. Please escort these 2 individuals out of the building, I instructed the head of security. They are never to be granted access to Vanguard Tower again. If they attempt to contact me or bypass the front desk, call the police and press charges for trespassing. Chloe cried out one last time as the guards firmly grasped her arms and pulled her to her feet. She looked back at me, her eyes pleading for a mercy she had never once shown me. Calvin did not fight. He stood up slowly, his heavy frame moving with the stiff, defeated shuffle of an old, broken man. He did not look back at me. He simply stared at the floor as the security team marched them both out of my office. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, severing them from my life permanently. I sat in the absolute pristine silence of my penthouse suite. There was no lingering guilt. There was no profound sadness over the loss of my family. There was only the clean, refreshing sensation of a massive, suffocating weight finally being lifted from my shoulders. The toxic roots that had tangled around my life for 15 years had been completely severed. A few moments later, the smart glass panels of the executive conference room shifted from frosted to transparent. Elias walked smoothly into my office. He was not carrying legal portfolios or financial spreadsheets this time. He was carrying 2 tall crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. He set the glasses down on my mahogany desk and expertly popped the cork. He poured the sparkling golden liquid into the crystal flutes, the quiet fizzing sound echoing pleasantly through the large room. The foreclosure orders have been officially filed with the city, Elias reported, handing me one of the glasses. The accounts are locked. The transition of assets is entirely complete. Vanguard Holdings is stronger than it has ever been. I took the crystal glass and stood up from my desk. I walked slowly across the plush carpet toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the far wall of my office. The morning sun was climbing higher into the crisp blue sky, casting a brilliant, warm light over the sprawling city below. I looked out over the towering skyscrapers, the busy highways, and the endless, affluent neighborhoods of Atlanta. It was a city that Calvin and Liam had tried to conquer with lies and stolen money. It was a city I now owned, a significant piece of built entirely on my own relentless ambition and unshakable discipline. I thought about the scared 20-year-old girl who had lost her father 15 years ago, and I smiled at the powerful 35-year-old executive standing in her place. Elias stepped up beside me, looking out at the same magnificent view. He raised his glass slightly. To the future, Elias said quietly. I looked at my brilliant, loyal attorney, a man who had stood by my side while I built this empire from the ashes of my father's stolen legacy. I raised my glass to meet his. The delicate crystal rang out with a clear, sharp chime. To absolute financial independence, I replied. To unshakable boundaries. And to the incredibly sweet taste of total freedom. I took a slow sip of the champagne. It was cold, crisp, and absolutely perfect. For the first time in 35 years, I was completely in control of my own destiny. I had learned the hardest, most valuable lesson a person can ever learn. Blood does not make a family, and shared genetics do not entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your success. If the people at your table only want to see you at the bottom, you do not sit there and take their abuse. You buy the building, you flip the table over, and you build a brand new empire exactly the way you want it. Have you ever had to cut off highly toxic family members who tried to use your success against you? How did you finally establish the boundaries you needed to protect your own peace and financial independence? Share your thoughts and your own stories of sweet justice in the comments below. And if this story resonated with your own journey of overcoming manipulation, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about resilience, strict boundaries, and claiming the success you truly deserve. Thank you so much for listening, and always remember that your worth is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it. The narrative of Maya's triumph over her uncle's deceit serves as a powerful testament to the necessity of financial independence and the establishment of uncompromising boundaries. True strength does not lie in securing the validation of toxic relatives, but in the quiet, methodical cultivation of personal success. When familial ties are weaponized to enforce subordination, loyalty must be redirected inward. This journey illustrates that blood relations do not entitle anyone to exploit your peace, dignity, or resources. Often the most profound act of self-preservation is allowing those who attempt to bury you to orchestrate their own spectacular downfall. Real power remains silent until the exact moment it needs to be deafening. The ultimate retribution against those who systematically undermine your worth is outgrowing their sphere of influence entirely and building an empire where their opinions hold absolutely no currency. Overcoming emotional and financial manipulation requires patience and strategic foresight, proving that the best defense is absolute self-reliance. Have you ever had to establish uncompromising boundaries to protect your success from toxic relatives? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please subscribe for more narratives of resilience and absolute empowerment.